Hey everybody, and welcome back. This is our third video on the rise of industrialization in America, and in this video we're really going to dig into what you probably picture when you think of industrialization: big corporations and railroads and robber barons and all that good stuff. But before we begin on any of that, let's establish one more really important economic term that we're going to use throughout this episode. And this is a word that you've definitely heard before, but maybe not in an economic sense. This term is competition. In an economic sense, competition is defined as when multiple companies or multiple individuals, all offering the same product or service, attempt to outdo their rivals by improving quality or lowering prices. And theoretically, competition is a really crucial regulating system in a healthy capitalist economy. This is something that Adam Smith wrote extensively about in The Wealth of Nations, suggesting that essentially the reason that these capitalist economies are theoretically more efficient is because when you have multiple companies offering the same service, they're going to be constantly innovating to try to get more business by improving those quality and lowering those prices, which is good for the consumer because you get more for your money. In theory, competition was a key component of that invisible hand that would expand the economy and offer more opportunities for everybody, but especially in this period of great industrialization, we see the mechanism of competition break down as the economy comes to be dominated by a very small number of gigantic corporations. But just to illustrate how this is supposed to work, let's look at a hypothetical example. Let's say you decide to open a hot dog stand. Now, you're not going to be the only hot dog stand in town. And for the purpose of this example, let's say that there's another hot dog stand right across the street. If the hot dog stand across the street is charging $1 for every hot dog and you try to charge $5 for every hot dog, what's going to happen? All your customers are going to go to your competitor and you're going to go out of business. Because of the existence of competition, this guarantees that you can't totally rip off your customers, because if you try to charge an outrageous price, they can easily go to your competitor. So let's say that you want more business, you want to capture as many customers as you can. You kind of have two choices. Either you can lower your prices, if that's possible. If your competitor is charging $1 and you're charging 75 cents, that will probably get you some more business. Or the other thing you can do is you can improve your product. You can start serving gourmet hot dogs or offering free sauerkraut or doing something that will show your customers that maybe it's worth paying a little bit extra for your hot dogs because they're better. And if your hot dogs are either much higher quality or less expensive, then what's your competitor going to do? If he doesn't either improve his quality or lower his prices, then he's going to go out of business. So theoretically, the long-term effects of a competitive marketplace like between these two hot dog stands is benefit for the consumer. Not only do they have choices between hot dog stand A or hot dog stand B, but these two hot dog stands are both trying to keep their prices as low as possible and their quality as high as possible, which means cheaper, better hot dogs for everybody, which sounds wonderful to me. Now, theoretically, this concept of competition should lead to higher quality and lower cost options across the board throughout an economy. But what we're going to see is that throughout the industrial era, as more and more of the economy is dominated by gigantic corporations, this concept of competition begins to break down as these companies become so big that they can manipulate these forces of competition. Now, I just used another term that we should probably define before we move forward: corporation. Corporation actually comes from the same root word as corpse because it describes a large group of people or a large business that for legal purposes exists as a single entity or one body. Corporations usually allow for external investment through the purchase of stock, which we covered in our first video, and are usually controlled by a board of directors who run the company on behalf of the stockholders. And the goal of the board of directors is the same goal as that of the stockholders: to make as much money as possible. And we're going to look in detail at 3 business practices that came to kind of define this period and help explain how these corporations just got so massive and so powerful. The first concept we're going to cover is economies of scale. And economies of scale essentially means that the bigger a company gets, the more efficiently and cheaply it can produce a product. Now, this is partly because bigger companies tend to have more money on hand, which means that they can invest in new techniques and new technology that can kind of minimize the loss in the production process. But this is also due to integration strategies. And the next 2 concepts we're going to cover are vertical integration and horizontal integration. And we're going to go back to our good old friend, the hot dog stand, to kind of illustrate these. Vertical integration is when a company expands up the supply chain of its product so that it can create that product more efficiently. And a supply chain is basically the ingredients that a company needs in order to make its product. So for instance, if you open a hot dog stand, what do you need? You need buns, you need hot dogs, you need ketchup and mustard. Odds are you're going to have to buy all these products from another company. And what's the goal of that company? To make profit. So what does it do? It charges you a higher price than it costs to produce it. Vertical integration would be if you buy out the bakery that sells you your buns. That way you can produce them at cost. Essentially, you're cutting out the middleman. Maybe your baker was charging you so that he made 5 cents of profit on every hot dog bun that he sold you. If you cut out that middleman, that means that you could drop your price of your hot dog 5 cents and make the same amount of profit. So now you're charging 95 cents for your hot dog, and maybe more people are coming to your stand rather than your competitors. On one hand, this is more efficient and would potentially allow you to produce a cheaper product for your customers. But on the other hand, it's not great if you're the baker, the small business owner that just got bought out by your big hot dog mega company. And next we'll talk about horizontal integration, which is essentially when you buy out your competitors. In our hot dog example, that would be if you walk across the street and you offer your competitor some amount of money for his hot dog stand. And hopefully that strikes you as a little bit dangerous, because we just discussed how crucial competition was to creating high quality products and fair prices for consumers. If you're the only hot dog game in town, what incentive do you have to charge fair prices and provide a high quality product? Your consumers can't go anywhere else. And now to synthesize all these ideas, these giant corporations that emerge through the Industrial Revolution, they benefit from economies of scale, they participate in vertical integration, and eventually they get to a point where they can buy out the competition and charge whatever they want. Now, we've already discussed stock, partial ownership in a company, as something that's typically purchased by individuals who are investors. But in the Industrial Revolution, big corporations realize that they themselves can buy stock in companies and will often buy stock in their competitors, sometimes buying a controlling stake and basically just acquiring and controlling these other companies that should be their competition. Now, in some extreme cases, these big companies would come to control an entire industry, sometimes creating what we call a monopoly. Now, monopoly, just like the board game, the purpose is to buy up all the property so that you can raise the prices. And that is exactly what a monopoly is. A monopoly is when one company becomes the only supplier of a given good or service, and by eliminating the competition, inevitably the quality of that good or service goes down and the prices go up. Monopolies are obviously very bad for the consumer. And even in the United States, which really embraced the laissez-faire idea of the free market, monopolies are outlawed, and it becomes illegal for one company to control an entire industry. However, by the late 1800s, big corporations come up with a legal workaround to avoid this law. It's kind of a loophole known as trusts. And this is when you would have multiple companies within a single industry that would all buy up each other's stocks and be controlled by the same guys on their boards of directors. This way, even though they weren't technically a monopoly, technically they were still multiple companies, these companies would be controlled by the exact same people and would certainly not be competing with each other to lower their prices. Instead of competition, we get collusion, which is when you have multiple businesses which should be competing with each other to lower their prices. Instead, they come together, they set their prices so that they can charge whatever they want, and the customer has no choice but to pay these high prices. To bring this back to our hot dog cart example, this would be that instead of lowering your prices to try to get customers to choose you instead of your competitor, you take a walk across the street and you say, hey, yo, buddy, what if we both agree to charge $5 for hot dogs? And that way people have no choice but to pay this outrageous price, and then we make a ton of money. Now, this example is a little bit silly because if they were charging $5 for hot dogs, you or I would probably just go buy a slice of pizza or something else that was cheap. But when this concept makes its way into essential services and goods, people have no choice but to pay an outrageous price, and the colluding companies make an outrageous amount of money. Now, probably the most famous example of this phenomenon of trusts and collusion is Standard Oil, which was the oil company owned by John D. Rockefeller, who, when you adjust for inflation, was probably the wealthiest man in human history. At its peak, the Standard Oil Company was the largest corporation in the world and controlled over 90% of the oil flow in the United States. John D. Rockefeller was able to do this by using the massive income of Standard Oil to buy up stock in his competitors and come to control them. And by eliminating the competition, he could charge whatever price he wanted. If he encountered a competitor that refused to sell to him, he would drive them out of business using uncompetitive business practices. One thing he would do is lower the price of his oil so much in the area of his competitors that all the competitors' customers would instead come to his business. And he would be selling this oil at a loss, but because he owned the biggest company in the world, he could afford to take a loss for a little while. Meanwhile, his competitor, the smaller company, could not. And then once they went out of business, he would go back to charging whatever the heck he wanted. The Standard Oil Trust was so huge that by the time it was finally busted and broken up by the federal government, it was split into 34 separate oil companies, some of which, like Chevron and ExxonMobil, are still around selling oil and warming our planet to this day. A similar phenomenon to trusts that emerged in this time period were holding companies. And these were companies that didn't actually produce anything themselves, but instead used massive amounts of money or capital to buy up other companies and then keep the profits that they generated. Many of these holding companies emerged out of banks since they had a ton of money on hand, and the most famous ones were probably JP Morgan and Wells Fargo, which are still around today. Now, at this point, I'm hoping you're saying, well, hold up. The theoretical benefits of capitalism are an increased efficiency in an economy. And right now we're talking about companies that produce no goods themselves and simply collect profit from other productive companies. This form of corporate capitalism was succeeding in growing the economy and capturing tremendous amounts of profit, but was not, as Adam Smith had predicted, benefiting society as a whole. And while this period produced some of the wealthiest men in human history, the experience of industrialization for the average worker was one of extreme poverty and squalor. And we'll cover all that wonderful stuff next week. But for now, suffice to say that the contrast between extreme wealth and extreme poverty was not lost on the average citizen. But despite these massive economic problems, most elected officials were reluctant to intervene in economic matters, partially due to the conventional wisdom about laissez-faire, about how the government shouldn't intervene with the economy, and also partially because the gigantic corporations that were benefiting from these policies weren't exactly the type of organizations that you'd want to make political enemies with. Though for today's primary source, we're going to zoom in on one political figure who did make a political point of opposing gigantic monopolies and trusts, President Theodore Roosevelt. In his 1901 State of the Union, he acknowledged the anger felt by many Americans at these gigantic corporations, saying, "There is a widespread conviction in the minds of the American people that the great corporations known as trusts are in certain of their features and tendencies hurtful to the general welfare. This springs from no spirit of envy or uncharitableness, nor lack of pride in the great industrial achievements that have placed this country at the head of the nations struggling for commercial supremacy. It is based upon sincere conviction that combination and concentration should be not prohibited, but supervised and within reasonable limits controlled." And I think this is interesting because this is one of the more radical mainstream voices of opposition to trusts and monopolies. But when you look at the way he speaks, like, oh, we're not speaking out of envy, we're not uncharitable, we know that companies have done great things, it illustrates just how powerful these companies really were and how reluctant politicians were to oppose them. But even this kind of timid opposition to big corporations represented a big departure from these laissez-faire ideas toward a new theory of politics known as progressivism. And progressivism was the idea that the government can and should intervene in the economy to solve social problems and maximize the general welfare. Sort of. And we'll talk about the benefits and shortcomings of progressivism another time. So to recap, in this episode, we covered the rise of corporations. We defined the economic terms competition and corporation, and then we covered some of the methods that corporations used in this time period to expand, such as economies of scale, vertical integration, and horizontal integration. We talked about how corporations bought stock and became trusts and sometimes monopolies. We talked about holding companies, and then took a look at the words of Theodore Roosevelt to introduce the concept of progressivism. Next time, we're going to move away from these big picture economic concepts and instead zoom in on the little people and talk about the effects that industrialization had on the everyday life of average working Americans. I'll see you then.